Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on House Concurrent Resolution 3.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, members of the House, the FACE Act prohibits threats of force, obstruction, and property damage intended to interfere with reproductive health care services. Let me just go over that again. Prohibits threats of force, obstruction, and property damage intended to interfere with reproductive health care services. The Justice Department has said this act is not just about abortions, but applies as well to pro-life, I'm quoting, pro-life pregnancy counseling services and other pregnancy support facilities providing reproductive health care. So it applies across the board. Now here's the problem. On May 8, 2022, Mother's Day, activists targeted a pro-life nonprofit center in Madison, Wisconsin, setting it ablaze and vandalizing it with the words, "If abortions aren't safe, then you aren't either." On June 3rd, 2022, left-wing anti-life activists targeted the Capitol Hill Crisis Pregnancy Center, throwing red paint on the door, eggs in the window, and spray painting the building with "Jane Says Revenge." On June 25th, 2022, in Longmont, Colorado, vandals graffitied and set fire to the Life Choices Free Pregnancy Center. And this has happened dozens and dozens and dozens of times all across the country. What's the Justice Department done? To my knowledge, no one. No one has been prosecuted under the FACE Act. Not one single person to my knowledge. But if you're a pro-life activist and you're praying outside an abortion clinic like Mark Houck, guess what happens to you? FBI kicks in your door, arrests you, puts you in handcuffs, and does it in front of your wife and 7 children. That's what happens. So we want this. Look, we don't want violence anywhere. As Mr. Cicilline said in 1 minute, we don't want any violence anywhere. But let's not have this double standard. Not to mention this. Think about what happened after the Dobbs decision was leaked. The leaked draft of that opinion. You had activists protesting at every not everyone, because only the conservative justices' names were doxed and information put out there. You had protests at their place in direct violation of a statute, 18 U.S.C. 1507. You're not supposed to be protesting, interfering when a decision is pending in front of a Supreme Court justice's home. Direct violation of the statute, and again, nothing happened. And that situation, as we all know, got real serious with the assassination attempt on Justice Kavanaugh. So this resolution is straightforward. What has happened literally now at hundreds of crisis pregnancy centers and churches around the country this past year is just flat out wrong. And this is a resolution that says we appreciate the good work that happens at crisis pregnancy centers where they take in women, where they help them and help that unborn child. Make sure that that unborn child gets to experience the gift of life. The sanctity of life is what this is all about. And so I want to commend my colleague and friend, Mr. Johnson, from the great state of Louisiana for this resolution, and the people across the country who volunteer and work every day at these centers to help these ladies who are in a tough situation. And with that, I reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to this woefully incomplete resolution. I'd like to begin by saying that I condemn violence in all its forms, including the threats, vandalism, and property destruction described in H-Con Res. 3. I would also like to reiterate my condemnation of the attempted murder of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. That should go without saying. I am grateful that no one appears to have been physically injured in the vandalism incidents described in the resolution, and that law enforcement took Justice Kavanaugh's would-be assassin into custody before he could complete an act of violence. In a democracy, violence is never the answer to a political dispute, and it should be roundly condemned in all its forms. This resolution, however, is a transparent partisan ploy that is a woefully and unacceptably inadequate condemnation of violence. It comes in the context of extremist MAGA Republicans' effort to enact a total ban on abortion at both the state and federal levels. And in what appears to be a glaring omission to H-Con Res. 3, my Republican colleagues refused to condemn the long-documented history of violence, murder, and mayhem perpetrated by anti-abortion extremists against abortion providers and their patients. According to the National Abortion Federation, since 1977, anti-abortion extremists have been responsible for 11 murders, 42 bombings, 196 arsons, 491 assaults, and thousands of incidents of criminal activities directed at patients, providers, and volunteers. Sadly, these incidents have increased dramatically in recent years. In 2021, abortion providers faced a 600% increase in stalking incidents, a 450% increase in clinic blockades, a 163% increase in reports of hoax devices or suspicious packages, a 129% increase in invasions, and a 128% increase in assault and battery compared to previous years. In some cases, violence against abortion providers has had deadly consequences. For example, in November 2015, a gunman murdered 3 people and injured 9 others when he opened fire with an assault-style rifle at a Planned Parenthood health center in Colorado Springs. In January 2021, a gunman attacked the Planned Parenthood clinic in Knoxville, Tennessee, and later that year, the same clinic was burned to the ground by arsonists. Regardless of your position on abortion rights, it is important that we condemn all acts of violence, regardless of who is the ultimate target. I'm concerned that by refusing to condemn violence against providers, this resolution will inadvertently send a signal to anti-abortion extremists that violence against abortion providers is justified by the vandalism described in the resolution. If this inadequate resolution could potentially fan the flames of political discord, what purpose then does it serve? The only purpose I can infer is that it is intended to placate the extreme elements of the anti-abortion movement while this Republican majority figures out how to pass a total nationwide ban on abortion. Let me be clear. Democrats stand with the majority of the American public and will oppose such a radical position. H-Con Res 3 is nothing more than a partisan political ploy designed to advance an extreme anti-abortion agenda and is not a serious effort to condemn political violence. Indeed, it may have the opposite effect on the American public because it purposely fails to condemn the thousands of threats, violent incidents, and attacks that abortion providers and patients have endured for decades at the hands of anti-abortion extremists. I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserved. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, what purpose? Says it right in the title, expressing the sense of Congress condemning the recent attacks on pro-life facilities, groups, and churches. Over 100 churches and pro-life facilities have been attacked in the last 7 months. Over 100. That's all this resolution. I don't know. Republicans condemn violence every time it happens. We condemn it when it happens to abortion clinics. We condemn it when it happens to churches. We condemn it when it happens to pro-life centers. We condemn it when it happened in the summer of 2020 all over the country. We condemned it when it happened on January 6th. We condemn it every single time. This is just highlighting what has happened in the last 7 months with churches and pro-life centers around the country. That simple. I wouldn't know why this should be unanimous. I recognize my friend, the sponsor of this great legislation from Louisiana, for 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Chairman Jim Jordan. I rise today to speak in favor of my common sense legislation, the House Concurrent Resolution 3. And I'm really proud that this bill has been included among our very first set of bills that will pass in this Congress. For Chairman Nadler to stand here, or Ranking Member Nadler now, I'm happy to say, to stand here and suggest that this does not fulfill the will of the American people, or it's somehow not the right thing to do, is absurd. This resolution is very simple and its language is clear. It condemns the attacks that have been committed against pro-life facilities, groups, and churches in the wake of the leak of the Dobbs opinion and the subsequent decision. It also calls upon the Biden administration to take action now to bring the perpetrators to justice. Who could be opposed to that? In recent years, there's been an alarming trend of more and more attacks on pro-life organizations and individuals. And in the wake of the Dobbs decision, the problem became much worse. We've seen a significant increase in targeted violence against places and people who provide care for pregnant women and their unborn children. Here's just a few of the more than 100 incidents that have taken place just in the last several months. May 5th, last year, a Catholic church and school in Armada, Michigan was vandalized with satanic symbols and messages calling for the death of Republicans. May 8th, the Oregon Right to Life office was firebombed. May 26th, 7 high school students in New Jersey were suspended after physically assaulting another student holding a pro-life sign. June 26th, a pro-abortion extremist was charged with attempted murder in Los Angeles. July 7, Sacramento, a pregnancy care center was threatened by a man with a machete. September 24th, in Lake Odessa, Michigan, an elderly pro-life volunteer was shot while canvassing door to door to discuss an abortion ballot proposal. January of this year, just several days ago, a pro-life billboard was defaced with the words, "Kill them kids," in Portland, Oregon. This last one that I wanted to mention is personal to me. On July 11th, pro-abortion activists vandalized the Women's New Life Clinic in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They spray-painted anti-life messages on the walls. Being located right next to the abortion provider in Baton Rouge, at the time the largest in our state, this clinic has offered hope to countless pregnant women by counseling them on all of their options and not pushing them to abort their unborn children as the clinics do. I'm proud to call many of the leaders of that clinic in Baton Rouge personal friends. We have to stand for them and stand against violence and vandalism and personal threats and intimidation. Nationwide, there are over 2,700 pregnancy care centers providing essential services in all 50 states. They serve millions of women every year. They have over 10,000 medical professionals supporting them. They do not deserve the treatment they've endured, and they certainly deserve that this Congress condemn the violence committed against them. Since there's been so little accountability for the leaked draft Dobbs opinion and the ensuing violence and intimidation against pro-lifers that's followed, we're making the position of Congress clear today. We condemn violence, property damage, threats, and intimidation tactics, and these clear violations of federal and state laws must be prosecuted. We have the opportunity before us today to start to push back against the mob that has targeted the groups and individuals that care for women and their unborn children. Republicans are ready to act. I'm so proud that over 100, I think nearly 130 Republicans so far have co-sponsored this. It will pass, and it should, and it will be a shame if our Democrat colleagues do not join us in this condemnation of violence. The question is, will they? I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
The resolution condemns violence at pro-life clinics, but not at pro-choice clinics. That says it all. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. Madam Speaker, first I'd like to note what is profound hypocrisy going on in this chamber. Last week we heard from the Republicans about the importance of an open process and the ability to offer amendments on all bills or resolutions. But there were no hearings on this resolution, there were no markups, and amendments are prohibited. If they were allowed, we could have discussed, and Mr. Jordan could have made his statement that he believes the Justice Department says this would affect all type facilities, but we didn't have that, so it's not here. Every Democrat, and I hope every Republican, rejects and condemns political violence. We settle our disagreements at the ballot box and through the rule of law, not by violent actions. Republicans say this resolution is about condemning violence and enforcement of laws, yet it only condemns those of their favorite organizations and facilities, the pro-life crowd. They should be aghast that they don't include the murders of the 11 people killed at abortion care providers since 1993. Dr. George Tiller, killed in Kansas, entering his church in Wichita, Kansas, shot in the back. David Gunn, shot in the head while at his clinic in Pensacola, Florida. Just this past New Year's in Knoxville, Planned Parenthood clinic was destroyed by arson. Sadly, there are too many property crimes at Planned Parenthood and other facilities that help people with abortion needs to mention. None are mentioned. We should condemn all murders and serious violence. This House did not hear from Republicans condemning the violence of January the 6th when this chamber was under attack, and we should do that in all cases. They're trying to undermine and obstruct the Department of Justice as well. It's just some of the other hypocrisy. They're having a committee to look into the attacks on America from the FBI, the Justice Department, and security services. Those are law enforcement. That is defunding federal law enforcement, and it's wrong. We should support all law enforcement and fund all of it in its activities. If you want to know about the Republicans, you'd ask them about the bill on the IRS. If they wanted to help the middle class, they'd have brought a resolution to direct the IRS to do more audits, even all of its audits, on people earning over $1 million and save the middle class and get the money where it is. They did not. We should listen to what they do, not what they say. I'll vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just point out to my friend from Tennessee, it's not that I believe the DOJ has the ability to use the FACE Act to prosecute people who vandalize and attack crisis pregnancy centers. They've said it. The Department of Justice says they can do that. I'm just asking why they haven't. With that, I yield to my good friend from Alabama, 1 minute.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I would like to thank my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson. He's in his leadership on all these pro-life issues. Madam Speaker, in the wake of the Dobbs decision, pro-abortion radicals have waged horrific attacks on our pro-life community. Pro-life institutions are on the front line of meeting the needs of women, youth, and yes, men. They provide critical services and support and have saved so many lives. Nobody, and I say nobody, should be in fear for their safety when seeking medical care and spiritual support. This body has an opportunity to express its unwavering support for the women and the families across America and this country and condemn these violence by voting for this act. I'm proud to be part of this effort. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes on this resolution. Thank you, and I yield my time back.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
This is a solemn moment. And I join my fellow colleagues, the women of the Democratic caucus, to stand here because we stand in the name of those who have died. 11 murders, 42 bombings, 196 arsons, 491 assaults, and thousands of incidents of criminal activity directed at our doctors, our nurses, and our patients. After COVID-19, America woke up to the vitality and the necessity of our medical professionals. But I want to come here today to express my concern. I wish my friend from Louisiana had worked together so that we would acknowledge that there has been loss of life of innocent persons who simply were providing their medical care. Dr. David Gunn was shot and killed by an opponent of abortion during a protest. Former pastor kills a doctor and clinic volunteer. George Tiller, twice a target, is killed. And so this legislation is an extreme initiative because it is not here to acknowledge the solemnity of which we stand. First, to recognize the constitutional right of a woman, a doctor in her faith, to be able to make a decision without fear and intimidation. But we have a state like mine that has vigilantism because it's passed legislation for bounty hunters to come back again from the 1800s to intimidate doctors and patients and nurses. This is a day that we must stand against. If we're to work together on this solemn moment, we must recognize all of the doctors and nurses and patients that have been intimidated. The National Abortion Federation in 2021 indicates that there has been an increase in violence. The significant increases in stalking, 600%, blockades, 450%, hoax devices, 163%, and 129%. So I ask my colleagues to oppose this legislation. Maybe we can, in solemnity, work together on this serious issue. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to our colleague from the great state of Ohio, Mr. Winstrom.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution, which condemns the wave of attacks on pro-life groups and facilities. As a nation, we are blessed to have a nationwide network of faithful, dedicated pro-life pregnancy centers that provide care for pregnant women and their babies. Women deserve to be offered the full range of health support that can help them in their time of need. Pro-life pregnancy centers do exactly that, offering a compassionate support system for pregnant women. Shamefully, since the Dobbs decision was rendered, these pregnancy centers have been under attack by radical abortion activists. We've seen horrific displays of vandalism, threats, and intimidation. directed at pro-life groups and facilities for the simple fact that they support life. And they serve to help pregnant mothers in need. No one is forced to receive care at a pregnancy center, yet we see people committing violence on pregnancy centers. Why? Why? Are they angry that so many choose to not terminate the life of their own baby and let their child live rather than violently terminate the life of their own baby like all of your mothers did? I ask Congress to stand together and strongly condemn this violence by passing this resolution. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
The gentlewoman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise because I'm appalled that this is how my Republican colleagues have chosen to start this majority. It appears that actually legislating is just too great a challenge for my colleagues who have no apparent plan to address the real issues facing our country, including the rising tide of violent extremism. Res 3 condemns violence against anti-abortion organizations. It says nothing about the violence against abortion providers that has gone largely unaddressed for nearly 50 years. Last year, I supported legislation that offered real solutions to rising violence against abortion providers. I'd be happy to work with my colleagues on fixing Res 3 to actually acknowledge the rising violence, but I cannot and will not support it in its current form and encourage my colleagues to vote no. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the resolution before us here. Last year, a draft Supreme Court opinion was leaked to the media in one of the biggest scandals to ever hit the nation's highest court. It reestablished the authority of states to prohibit the killing of unborn children, sending the Democrat Party and other left-wing extremists off the deep end. The liberal brush fire that ignited after the opinion was leaked wasn't contained to just Washington. Pregnancy centers and pro-life organizations across the country soon became the target of their rage. The chairman said it very well in his opening comments when he cited the situation in Madison, Wisconsin. If abortions aren't safe, then you aren't either. That's what it says right here. Following the attack, a radical pro-abortion group known as Jane's Revenge took credit, proudly proclaiming this was only a warning. Next time, the infrastructure of the enslavers will not survive. Left-wing extremists have shown us time and time again, first during the summer of 2020, when they burned American businesses to the ground, and then by firebombing pregnancy centers in 2022, that they will resort to violence and destruction when they do not get their way. Unfortunately, there has been very little accountability for the leaked draft opinion. This resolution makes it clear violence needs to stop. I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Connecticut, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. DeLauro.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in strong opposition to the dangerous measures that House Republicans are bringing to a vote in this chamber. It's part of their ongoing efforts to end a woman's right to choose, inserting politics unnecessarily and wrongly into the doctor-patient relationship, deny abortion care to women, stigmatize women who get abortions, and put at risk the doctors who simply are doing their jobs by caring for them, all while ignoring the threats that abortion providers and patients face daily. The American people sent a clear message during the midterms, and I quote, "Politicians have no place in our personal medical decisions," end quote. But House Republicans refuse to listen. Instead of protecting and expanding reproductive health care and women's rights, they are making it their first order of business to use their power to control women's bodies and their future. I condemn violence in all of its forms. This resolution condemns only some violence and very intentionally omits violence like the murder of health professionals against abortion providers, patients, and their families. Maybe they don't regard murder as violence. This comes at the same time as women's rights are under attack. This non-binding resolution is meant to only divide and distract, will do nothing to actually reduce violence. Urge my colleagues to oppose these biased bills. Continue to stand up and speak out for what is right. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Mississippi.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of the resolution condemning the recent attacks on pro-life groups, facilities, and churches. Last summer, in a landmark decision, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of my home state of Mississippi, returning decisions on protecting life to the states. Unfortunately, the leak of the Dobbs decision led to instances of extremism committed against churches, pro-life institutions, and crisis pregnancy centers. Sadly, my home state was not spared. Mississippi has a robust network of crisis pregnancy centers that provide care and resources to expectant mothers. I and many of my Republican colleagues have called on the Biden administration to address these criminal acts and hold accountable those who committed these offenses. But to date, no action has been taken. I am hopeful that this legislation will move the administration to act, and I'm grateful that the Republican majority is standing with those impacted by last year's extremist acts. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
The gentlewoman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I strongly oppose violence and destruction of property regardless of venue. The resolution on the floor today, however, is a distraction from the real issue regarding crisis pregnancy centers, which is that they regularly provide inaccurate, incomplete, and injurious information to people who are seeking guidance and fact-based health care. Crisis pregnancy centers often engage in deceptive advertising to get people in the door, and then they mislead them about the services they provide. A crisis pregnancy center in Texas, for example, was caught telling people that abortions cause mental illness and implying that abortions cause cancer and infertility. I heard from someone who visited a crisis pregnancy center, and after she left, she started getting calls from strangers who were told about her visit. And another woman was shown an ultrasound picture of her kidney and told it was a baby. This deception is unconscionable, which is why I will soon introduce the Stop Anti-Abortion Disinformation Act to direct the Federal Trade Commission to issue rules prohibiting unfair or deceptive advertising of abortion services. At a time when reproductive rights are under attack, it's especially important for anyone seeking abortion care to be able to find a real health care provider they can trust who will respect their bodily autonomy and their privacy. I yield back.
Bye. The gentleman from New York will reserve. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to my friend from the great state of Wisconsin, Mr. Grossman.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. One of the scary ongoing stories over the last few years, more typical of an atheistic totalitarian regime than our wonderful constitutional republic, has been attacks on pregnancy counseling centers. They are hated because they try to persuade women to keep their babies, and they articulate how precious life is in the womb, which is considered to be dangerous speech to those who desperately want to legalize eight-month abortions. Some of these attacks, like those in other venues by Antifa and Black Lives Matter, have become more physical in nature. The lack of urgency by law enforcement to protect the speech of those who want women to keep their children is dangerous. This effort to muzzle those who express a wide variety of conservative Christian viewpoints has become more and more common and should scare anyone who does not want to live in a religiously hostile, large government state. Please vote for HRES 3.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from New York, the ranking member of the Small Business Committee, Ms. Velasquez.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in opposition of H.R. 3. This resolution is further proof of my colleagues' hypocrisy and their obsession with controlling a woman's inherent right to bodily autonomy. This resolution ignores the long-documented history of violence against abortion providers, their staff, and their patients. Violence is what Amanda Eade from Texas suffered last year when doctors could not induce labor after her amniotic fluid was leaking and her doctors were prohibited from providing the treatment she urgently needed because of Texas anti-abortion laws. Amanda's life will forever be changed, and that is the real violence. The American people is overwhelmingly support of protecting reproductive freedom. Women and the American people across this nation have spoken loud and clear. They do not want the government interfering with their reproductive health care. On behalf of all women in my district and across this country, I oppose this extreme resolution, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to a pro-life leader, the gentleman from New Jersey, my good friend.
I thank my good friend for yielding. Madam Speaker, 2 women spoke at a pregnancy care center dinner I attended in New Jersey. Both women were effusive in their thanks that the director had approached them in absolute kindness and empathy as they were literally walking from the parking lot to an abortion clinic. They changed their minds and were helped through their pregnancy and after the birth of their child or children as well. Later in the program, 2 young teenage girls spoke of the sanctity of life and the good work of the Pregnancy Care Center. In a very dramatic moment from the podium, because they were standing side by side, they turned to the director and thanked her and said that had she not reached out to their moms that day and followed up with such love and compassion, both of them would have been dead. Pregnancy care centers across the country have suffered a surge of violent attacks, firebombing, and vandalism by pro-abortion activists in a coordinated effort to intimidate frontline volunteers and licensed medical professionals providing critical support to mothers in need and their unborn baby girls and boys. Now more than ever, the Biden administration and law enforcement needs to enforce the law.
From time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio reserved. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, my, here we go again. Look, first of all, let's all condemn the violence on our streets of our country. But this resolution is a political ploy and a distraction from the violence that abortion providers and patients face every day. Bombings, murder, arson. Let's condemn these too. Madam Speaker, women across our country are being denied life-saving care, and health care providers are being punished for doing their jobs. Women deserve access to all forms of health services, including abortion, and the freedom to make decisions about their health and their lives and their future without interference of politicians. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this resolution, which sidetracks from the real danger women and health care providers are facing today, the Republican agenda. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, today I rise in support of House Concurrent Resolution 3 and urge my colleagues to vote in favor of its passage. In June of last year, following the decision by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, a pro-life pregnancy center that assists pregnant women in Nashville, Tennessee, was the victim of an attempted arson attack. Thankfully, no one was injured, and local law enforcement opened an investigation into the situation in an effort to bring the perpetrators to justice. But unfortunately, that is not the case across the entire United States, which is why it is essential that this body, the United States House of Representatives, condemns these heinous acts of political violence. I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation and will always and forever stand on the right side of history when it comes to protecting the unborn. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in opposition to the bill before us today. While I strongly condemn violence and vandalism in any form, the bill before us neglects to address the real crisis facing Americans today, which is the loss of reproductive rights for millions of Americans in the blink of an eye since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade last summer. 8 in 10 Americans support the legal right to abortion, something that's been seen over and over again in poll after poll, in election after election. This resolution is an attempt to muddy the waters and distract the public from the fact that those on the other side of the aisle support a national abortion ban, regardless of which state you live in. In fact, it was abortion providers who faced significant increases in stalking, invasions, assault, and battery as a result of the Dobbs decision. I cannot support this resolution, which conveniently leaves out the majority of the victims of this type of political violence. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield a minute to my good friend from the state of North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
For what time?
Minute.
1 minute. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, attacks on churches and pro-life pregnancy centers are unconscionable and un-American. Thugs elevate their extreme political ideology over the most basic gift from God, life. And this phenomenon is fed from here. All recall Senator Schumer's threat to Supreme Court justices. You will pay the price. Now we see the price. Firebombing pro-life pregnancy centers and assassination attempts. In my own state, that rhetoric amid the broken windows and red paint and anarchist symbols, if abortions aren't safe, neither are you. That sentence is repeated over and over across this country. That's a threat. This is the death cult's echo of the KKK's burning cross on the lawn. Brazen, violent intimidation. But the federal government responded to the KKK. Where is the Biden Justice Department amid this violent campaign of national scope? Mr. President, it's time for action. Do your duty. I yield.
Gentleman's time is expired. Members are reminded to direct their comments to the chair. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
These resolutions. You know, this is a poll-tested focus group effort to change the subject. We all know that attacking facilities or not providing health care to an infant is already illegal. This is a veiled attempt at distracting from the real consequences of the Dobbs decision. People have had their rights taken away and can no longer receive the care they wish. When we see doctors consulting their lawyers when patients are dying on operating tables because they're afraid of abortion bans, voting on this resolution is an embarrassment. It's unconscionable that when people are living in fear, even dying because they're denied health care, the House is ignoring this in favor of a political stunt. I stand with the American public and in opposition to this legislation.
The gentleman from Oregon yields. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Green.
The gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution. Being a mother is the greatest gift in the world, and childbirth is a true miracle of God. In 2019, pregnancy centers served roughly 2 million women, men, and youth. They provided services such as medical care, education, mentoring, and material support like diapers, car seats, and clothing. From 2016 through 2020, pro-life pregnancy centers partnered with pregnant women at risk for abortion to save over 800,000 lives. Approximately 75% of women at risk for abortion who view an ultrasound of their baby in the womb at a pregnancy center ultimately make the choice to continue their pregnancy. Merrick Garland calls parents who want to protect their kids from sexual indoctrination in schools domestic terrorists, but refuses to protect facilities that help pregnant women carry their babies from being attacked by far-left extremists. Since the Dobbs decision was leaked in May 2022 alone, approximately 40 churches and 60 pro-life pregnancy centers have been firebombed and vandalized across the country by pro-murder extremists. The range of cost of damages for each attack ranges from less than $100 to more than $250,000. Shameful. Some of the things they have said, they've spray painted on a church in Lansing, Michigan, abort the court, and death to Christian nationalism. Death for Christians that care about our country? I don't think so. They also caused $50,000 in damages in Bethesda, Maryland, setting fire to 3 churches. It's shameful. Jane's Revenge, which is a terrorist group, said if abortion isn't safe, neither are you. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Fletcher.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I join my Democratic colleagues in opposing on the strongest terms all forms of political violence. That is something that this resolution fails to do. This resolution fails to acknowledge decades of well-documented violence against reproductive health care providers in this country. And in failing to do so, it fails us all. I've seen that violence firsthand. More than 30 years ago, when I was a teenager, I stood in defense of our local Planned Parenthood as anti-abortion protesters tried to chain themselves to the doors to prevent women from going in not only to get abortion care, but to get their pap smears, their birth control, HIV tests, and other services. A few years later, a well-known anti-abortion activist drove a van through the front door of that same Planned Parenthood. Like I said, I welcome the opportunity to vote on legislation that condemns all forms of political violence. But the resolution's purposeful omission of abortion providers and patients and what that suggests is why I'm voting no today, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Speaker, we reserve.
Gentleman from Ohio reserved. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
I am against all forms of violence, including violence against any one of the majority of Americans who support abortion rights. The statistics are absolutely clear. Since 1977, there have been 100 murders. There have been 11 murders, 47 bombings, 196 arsons, 49 assaults, and thousands of more illegal attacks on people who support abortion rights. Let's include everyone in here. When we talk about no more violence, we have to make sure that people who are pro-life and pro-people who support abortion rights, and we support life, are included in opposing violence.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
We reserve, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Ohio reserved. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you for yielding, Mr. Nadler. Madam Speaker, as co-chair of the Pro-Choice Caucus, I rise in opposition to H-Con Res 3. Of course we condemn all political violence, whether it's aimed at those we agree with or disagree with. These acts are all unacceptable, full stop. Hate speech quickly becomes hate violence. And in a democracy, violence is particularly awful when it is designed to silence or intimidate. But where were my colleagues every single time a doctor or a patient or a nurse, a security officer was threatened, assaulted, or murdered just for providing, accessing, and safeguarding reproductive health care? Congresswoman DeGette, Congresswoman Presley, and I have drafted a resolution which condemns all attacks on healthcare facilities, healthcare personnel, and patients. Every act of hate-fueled violence is worthy of condemnation, including those against Planned Parenthood clinics, abortion providers, and patients and other care providers. We stand with survivors of those attacks. We condemn all of them, and our GOP colleagues should do so as well. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of H-Con Res 3, which condemns the epidemic of attacks on pro-life and faith-based organizations. Unfortunately, Michigan's 5th District has not escaped these attacks. Last June, Jane's Revenge vandals graffitied and smashed the windows of Jackson, Michigan's Right to Life and my own office. It was a despicable act, and the Jane's Revenge perpetrator, who has yet to be caught, even accidentally graffitied a neighbor's house as well. Yet this darkness presented an opportunity to show the best of our community. Volunteers from the community came out to clean up the broken glass and help board up the windows. In contrast to this positivity displayed by everyday Americans, and despite congressional efforts we have spearheaded, President Biden's Justice Department has stayed silent on these acts of domestic terrorism. Today, congressional Democrats have an opportunity to right the wrongs of this administration and to join us in condemning these acts of violence as we condemn all acts of violence as well. Volunteers at pregnancy centers who remain committed to their convictions and efforts understand they have a target on their backs. These volunteers are individuals spending their time and their money to clothe, feed, provide shelter, and minister to women in crisis. Is this the progressive America my colleagues talk about? I think not. Does their idea of progress consist of political violence, targeting those who provide services to women and families? Are intimidation and violence acceptable to the Biden administration and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle? I hope not. And so I strongly urge support on this resolution for the benefit of lives, security, and decency in our country, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's time for our Republican colleagues to stop playing politics with women's bodies. With the fall of Roe, the criminalization of abortion access nationwide with no exceptions is well underway. Just last year in my home state of Florida, Governor DeSantis signed a 15-week abortion ban into law that offers no exceptions for rape, incest, or human trafficking, and more restrictive policies are coming. Other states are even more restrictive, and the bill and resolution before us will further erode women's reproductive rights. These measures incentivize violence by failing to condemn a history of violence against abortion providers and patients. And while millions of Americans will lose under these measures, its harshest impacts land on single, working, and women of color. A lack of access to safe abortions not only deprives women of the basic right to control her own body, it also stifles her future economic, education, and family planning opportunities. It basically hands her body and life and future over to the state. These horrific anti-abortion measures are a revolting assault on women's rights, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on both measures. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Chair, we reserve.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, for whom I think this is his first speech on the floor, Representative Frost.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We've heard the word shameful a lot during this debate. But what's really shameful is the fact that my Democratic colleagues and I are willing to both say we condemn all violence and also put it on paper. But with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, all we hear is talk. They're not willing to condemn all violence in this resolution. It's a one-sided resolution meant to fan the flames of anti-abortion and anti-freedom sentiment in this country. See, my district in Central Florida sees these sentiments in action as our governor has passed an abortion ban and looks to go even further, and as someone whose birth mother made the brave and difficult decision to put me up for adoption, I recognize that that decision was deeply personal and can often mark one of the most vulnerable points in a person's life. No one should take advantage of that, and the federal government should actually protect it. I will continue to fight for civil rights, personal freedom, and bodily autonomy of women and childbearing adults in this country, and I hope the rest of this chamber will join me in voting no. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. And the gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
We reserve.
The gentleman from Ohio reserved. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
The gentlewoman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. If my Republican colleagues want to condemn the growing level of political violence in this country, let's do it together. But that's not what this resolution does. What it does, it goes to great lengths to condemn attacks against anti-choice groups, and it says nothing about the growing threat of violence targeting women's health clinics across the United States. It doesn't condemn the numerous bullets that have been fired at healthcare clinics throughout the country. It doesn't condemn the bricks that have crashed through windows at providers' offices, or the assaults, kidnappings, and even the murders of doctors and healthcare personnel. It doesn't condemn the arsons, bombings, death threats, or any one of the more than 7,000 acts of violence that have been reported against these facilities. By ignoring these acts of violence, Republicans are sending a very dangerous message that will only embolden the extremists behind them. And that's why I ask unanimous consent, Madam Speaker, to enter into the record a resolution that Congresswoman Lee, Presley, and I have introduced to condemn all acts of political violence, regardless of their target or intent, and I would urge my colleague to support it instead.
The gentlewoman yields back. No, I didn't go back. I asked for unanimous consent. Sorry. Jim. Okay. Without objection.
I thank the gentlelady. The resolution of this, the resolved part of our resolution says this, and I think all of my colleagues should be able to join this. Resolved that the U.S. House of Representatives condemns all acts of political violence. 2, condemns attacks on healthcare facilities, healthcare personnel, and patients. And 3, affirms that all people have the access to access reproductive health care services and medical advice without fear of violence, intimidation, or harassment. Isn't that what this is all about in this country? Fear from violence. Fear, no violence. Everybody gets the health care services they want, that they deserve, without fear of being killed. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
The gentleman from Colorado has yielded 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding time, and I agree with my friend from Colorado that we should condemn all violence. We should condemn violence to unborn children also. That doesn't seem to be something that's shared on the other side of the aisle. One of the pregnancy centers that was targeted last year was Life Choices Pregnancy Medical Center located in my home state, and at the time in my district in Colorado. On June 25th at 3:17 a.m., first responders responded to a fire at the pregnancy center. The fire was the result of an angry protest acting out of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision. Not much was salvageable from the fire, but what remained were hateful and extreme messages graffitied on the exterior of the building. Kathy Roberts, the Executive Director of Life Choices, is here today to commemorate passage of this resolution. I'm honored to have Kathy here and to introduce her to this introduce you to this brave and dedicated woman. Thank you, Kathy, for being here. Sadly, our nation has become all too familiar with the violent attacks on pro-life centers. In 2022, over 100 pro-life centers were violently attacked, and there has been minimal accountability. Instead of Democrats accepting the Supreme Court Dobbs decision and condemning this violence, they have egged it on, including some who told pro-abortion protesters to rise up and commend their violence by stating it was a way for individuals to channel their righteous anger into meaningful action. Our nation is a nation of law and order, and violence is never the path we should pursue to create effective change. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Colorado yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York
Madam Speaker,
is
I now yield
recognized.
1 minute. What? I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley.
The gentlewoman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. As chair of the Abortion Rights and Access Task Force, I rise to make plain exactly what is going on here. This is not a debate about political violence. Political violence and the violent rhetoric that drives it is a persistent threat. My staff, my family, and I know that intimately. Everyone should condemn it. Our colleagues across the aisle continue to say the quiet part out loud in their selective contempt for political violence. This resolution seeks to deny necessary medical care from those who seek it. Abortion is health care and a fundamental human right. Across the nation, those seeking care are met with intimidation, violence, and even loss of life. Imagine walking through a screaming crowd to get to a medical appointment. Imagine being a doctor or a nurse dedicating your life to helping others, and day after day your workplace receives violent threats and you fear for your life. But that is not what the other side of the aisle is concerned about. No, today, they are seeking to mislead the American people. They are trying to conjure up hateful rhetoric, spreading misinformation about crisis pregnancy centers. Let me make it plain. Crisis pregnancy centers are no place to go to for reproductive health care. They are sham clinics that coerce folks seeking to terminate a pregnancy or to access the full range
Mr. Speaker,
of
I yield
reproductive
the
health
gentlelady
services.
another minute.
To those pressing these divisive anti-choice resolutions, we see right through you. Abortion is health care and a fundamental human right. I urge my colleagues to vote no.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You have 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner.
The gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized.
I thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my friend and colleague, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, for his strong defense of life, for the precious unborn, and for promoting a culture of life at all times. I stand, Madam Speaker, in support of H-Con Res 3, expressing the sense of Congress condemning the recent attacks on pro-life facilities, groups, and churches. There have been now nearly 100 recorded acts of violence and intimidation against pro-life individuals and organizations by radical pro-abortion activists since the initial leak of the draft Supreme Court Dobbs opinion. Following the leak and issuance of the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, anti-life fanatics have targeted, destroyed, or vandalized, as I said, over 100 pro-life facilities, groups, and churches to further their radical cause. Pro-life pregnancy centers nationwide play a critical and important role in supporting and assisting pregnant women and their children and their families. Because the Biden Justice Department refuses to protect these vital resource centers, Congress must be clear in condemning the violence against pro-life facilities. And I urge all of my colleagues to stand against violent and to support H-Con Res 3. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
We reserve.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
We're prepared to close.
The gentleman, is the gentleman from Ohio prepared to close? Okay. Then the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, if House Republicans were serious about condemning violence surrounding the debate on abortion, the resolution would be clear in condemning all acts of violence, lest we give tacit acquiescence to extremist anti-abortion violence against abortion providers. This resolution does not do that at all. Undoubtedly, my Republican colleagues will attempt to portray any opposition to this partisan resolution as proof of Democrats' so-called extreme position on abortion. But the American public is not so easily fooled. They will recognize this resolution for what it is, a transparent political exercise intended to lay the groundwork for MAGA Republicans' plans for a total nationwide ban on abortion. I urge all members to vote no, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to read what the resolution says. That Congress condemns recent attacks, over 100 of them in the last 7 months, on pro-life pregnancy centers and churches. Condemns recent attacks of vandalism, violence, and destruction against pro-life facilities, groups, and churches. Second, recognizes the sanctity of life, the important role pro-life facilities, groups, and churches play in supporting pregnant women, infants, and families. And 3, calls upon the Biden administration to use all appropriate law enforcement authorities to uphold public safety and protect the rights of pro-life facilities, groups, and churches. That's all it says. This is as apple pie as it gets. The hundreds of churches and crisis pregnancy centers that have been attacked in the last 7 months, this resolution says, Biden administration, use the FACE Act, which you've said applies not just to pro-abortion clinics, but also to pro-life crisis pregnancy centers. Use that to make sure we can stop this stuff from happening in the future. We condemn all violence every time it happens. Here's what's interesting. The violence against the abortion, that's been cited by the other side, against abortion clinics and people associated with them, guess what? Those individuals were prosecuted, and we support that. What we want to know is why. Why 100, with 100 attacks, over 100 attacks, why hasn't the Justice Department, to my knowledge, used the FACE Act to prosecute anybody? Why? Oh no, they say there's no political nature at the Justice Department now, there's no weaponization. Really? Because it sure looks like there's a conflict here. Sure looks like there's a double standard here. This resolution is as basic as it gets. I urge support. Hope this thing passes unanimously, and with that, we yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 5, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the